Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to the very first event of SRA North and Central. It's really great to have you all along tonight from so many different sectors, so many different interests in social research. One of the things you might like to get involved in is some training, and you've just been handed the SRA's training schedule for the year, including some new events that are on in Manchester. Right, but the moment you've all been waiting for, Helen. I'm sure many of you will know her work. Helen is Head of Analysis at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. She leads the team undertaking JRF's analysis and monitoring work, focusing on social, economic and public policy trends and changes affecting people and places in poverty. Helen joined the Foundation in 2005 as a Policy and Research Manager, and she has developed and led programmes of research and policy focusing on child poverty, labour markets, poverty and ethnicity, destitution and education. Before she joined the Foundation, she worked at BMRB Social Research and Opinion Leader Research, carrying out research on topics including benefits, tax credits, tax, education and housing. And before undertaking research on basically everything, really. Helen studied social and political sciences at Cambridge University. Right, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, it's great to be here. Apologies for the slightly late start, courtesy of my car. Some of you probably know the Foundation very well, others may not. So I'll start by just very quickly giving you a sense of who we are and what we do. And then I want to talk a little bit about the way in which we use particularly analysis that's looking at the geographies of different issues, so anything kind of under UK national level, and why we fund and carry out research like that, what we use it for, and some examples of how it's had some impact across some of the audiences we're communicating with. So first of all, just very quickly about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So we are based in York, that's where our roots are, from the Rowntree family, the chocolate factories, the model village and so on. We fund a lot of research and evidence. We also carry out now work in-house. And essentially what we're trying to do is inspire action to create a prosperous and poverty-free UK. The way we go about that is to understand the causes of poverty, try and develop solutions to those underlying causes, and more these days get into testing and demonstrating solutions through partnerships, through social investment, through evaluations, to try and go from idea to something that's implementable on the ground, scalable and so on. So the way in which we use analysis is very much focused on inspiring action. So we don't tend to fund or carry out research purely because we think it's interesting. We always have to have a purpose in mind, an audience in mind, and we have to be able to demonstrate to our trustees, among other people, that the way we're spending our charitable resources has a good chance of forwarding the issues we want to tackle. So what that means is we have to try and communicate with and inspire people at quite a lot of different levels and different places. So obviously with poverty, one tends to think initially of different governments. So the UK government, the devolved governments, local authorities, and more these days, city regions, mayors, LEPs and so on. But actually what our research, particularly in the last few years, has really been showing is that the idea that government can solve poverty on its own is a fallacy, that actually what we need as well is action from employers, from businesses, thinking about their own employment practices, thinking about their procurement, how they spend their money, thinking about the products and services they supply and how those can actually help people in poverty to meet their needs more cheaply. We also have found that working directly with communities and with other parts of the third sector can be an important part of that. And obviously, for really all of those other groups, getting the media to cover the issues we think are important, getting them to tell the stories we think the evidence suggests, is an important tool for engaging all these other audiences. So when we're doing research, when we're communicating it, we're having to think a lot of the time, which of these audiences do we actually think is going to use this bit of work? How does it need to be shaped and communicated to have the most impact when it's landing with them? So first of all, just to talk in general terms, I think there are basically three main ways in which reasons we would commission or we would carry out research that looks at geographical levels. So the first of those is when we are communicating with national stakeholders, so particularly UK governments, the devolved governments, or employers or businesses that operate on very much a national level. And there's two real reasons why, for those stakeholders, this can be powerful. The first is to understand the national problem. Quite often you have to understand the geographical dynamics. So one obvious example is thinking about education. We know we have a national problem of an attainment gap between the richer and poorer pupils, but actually solving that problem requires you to understand that London is doing brilliantly, and if you take London out of the picture, the rest of the country is doing even worse. And it also, understanding that, then leads you to think, well, what is different about London, either in terms of who's there or what they've done that could be replicated elsewhere. But even with the rest of the UK and the rest of England, within education, there's now a very strong focus on coastal areas, because when you break down the national problem, the places it's worst are quite often these deprived coastal regions that really haven't had a lot of attention. So actually solving the national problem, you have to go down geographically and then come up again. The other reason it can be important, though, is really more emotional, in a sense, that when you're talking to national stakeholders, most people have an emotional connection to some bit of the country. If they're an MP, they will always be engaged if you can explain to them how their constituency fits in and what's happening in their constituency. But even for people who don't obviously have that connection, for civil servants, for charities, for media people, quite often they are more interested if you can talk to them about how their part of the country, however that's defined, relates to this. So actually getting that hook in can be quite important to have the opportunity to tell the story, the national story you're trying to get across. The second way we use it is, in a sense, the more obvious way, which is for local stakeholders. So if we want metro mayors to take action on poverty in their areas, what they are really interested in is how do these different issues play out in my patch, and how does my area compare to other areas, and particularly if they're getting into it, what's the diversity within my area. So when we are doing briefings for the new metro mayors, what they want us to be able to do is profile what's happening in the general metro area and then tell them which bits of it are doing better and worse and which bits need different kinds of interventions. Similarly, it's very obvious when you talk to local authorities, they always want local authority data. They want something for themselves, they want something to tell them how they rank against everyone else. And for the devolved governments, one of my main learnings is that if you want devolved governments to read something, it has to have the name of their country in it. Even if it's exactly the same content, essentially, as everywhere else, you have to tailor it. But actually, in most cases, there is, to some extent, a different story to tell about how what appears to be a general problem plays out in Scotland or Northern Ireland or Wales as compared to England or the rest of the UK. And then the third area is around thinking about informing devolution. So obviously one of the big trends in our national life, really, both in recent years and before, has been the devolution from the UK government to devolved governments, and more now down to local authorities, to city regions, to mayors. And there are some really knotty questions from a poverty perspective about are there kinds of devolution which are better or worse for the point of view of tackling poverty? And that's quite a complicated question. There aren't always answers, but one example, our research has led us to believe that adult skills and employment services are probably best devolved down to at least a city region level, because you want to tailor them to a specific functioning labour market, and you want the people who understand that labour market to be able to pull together in a coherent way adult skills support for job seekers and people in low paid work, and business support. It's very hard to do that if you're looking purely at a national level. So actually that's one area where we have come from the research we've done to advocate that form of devolution. On the other hand, if you look at how council tax benefit has been devolved, that's probably an example of where devolution has certainly not given any gains in terms of poverty, and in many cases has probably made things worse. So using geographical analysis to let us come to an evidence-based view as to what is the right kind of devolution, I think is probably one of the hardest things, but has been very helpful. And I think the other way that then gets used by local stakeholders is it gives them some of the tools and ammunition to argue for what they think they need. So if we're going to the mayors and local combined authorities and saying, we think you should do this, this and this, if they believe us, if they take the evidence, they can then say, right, well, to do that, we're going to need these powers, this funding, these freedoms. They can use the evidence to go back to central government and argue for those things. So that's a kind of overview of why we use this kind of analysis quite a lot. I'm going to now pick off two quite recent examples. One, the first one, which is fairly straightforward basic analysis that we did in-house. I'll come say it's largely for engagement purposes, really. And the second is a much more in-depth, complicated project which the University of Sheffield did, which was getting into some really knotty issues around neighbourhood dynamics and how those play out in different places. So first of all, I'll just talk briefly through what these two bits of research were about and how we did them, and then I'll talk about examples of how they were actually used and had impact in these different ways. So first of all, a piece of research that we've done and we've updated at least once is what we ended up calling the Working Age Poverty Risk Index, which is a bit of a mouthful, but was the is essentially when you get the media team versus the analysts on how complicated can we make the name versus making sure it's honest. This is where we got to. The reason, those of you who work in this area will probably able to tell from what I say, the reason we've ended up calling it that is that it consists of, essentially we've taken a bunch of data which you either can get at parliamentary constituency level or can be constructed into constituencies, and we've turned it into maps across the, I think Great Britain, I don't think we could get Northern Ireland data at that level. So there's a number of different things. There is a composite risk index where basically we've taken the out-of-work benefit receipt figures and the in-work benefit receipt figures and combined them to give a fairly broad sense of what is the overall risk of having high levels of poverty in this place. We've then underlined, and that enables you to rank constituencies to give quite broad-based messages. But underneath that, we've then got the specific maps of where are there high levels of out-of-work benefit receipt, which is a fairly good proxy for out-of-work poverty, where are there high levels of in-work benefit receipt, which is a slightly less good proxy for in-work poverty. I mean, at this level, it's probably the best we've got, but it's not ideal, which is why we insisted the word risk had to be in every communication, because it is risk of poverty, not poverty itself we're measuring. And then looking at some of the drivers of poverty, both out-of-work and in-work poverty, low skills, so where in the country have you got a lot of people of working age with low levels of skills, and where in the country have you got particularly low earnings among those who are low paid. Those things are going to have a fairly big impact on both your starting point as an area, how big your problem is, and what you might need to do to move up the rankings to have less of a poverty risk problem. Now that was actually building on a much bigger and more complex piece of work called the Inclusive Growth Monitor, which I think the University of Sheffield started, the University of Manchester now updates for us every year, and that has a much bigger set of indicators and particularly is used to look at the core cities around the country and rank them in terms of how well they're doing at developing inclusive growth. We can talk later about what that means should anybody want to. There's a debate about the name. So what we essentially did with the risk index was that we were able to rank constituencies according to the composite risk index, and then when you kind of click into the page, what it does is give you how your constituency is doing against the national average for each of these indicators. So just to give you a picture, the overall thing looks like that. It's a little heat map. You can very quickly see best and worst places. You can then click on it and see the detail for those places. So as I said, the main reason for doing that really was about engagement, was about getting people to talk about the things we thought were important. So you can see there an example of the headline from the national press release we used. This was around the run-up to the publication of our Solving Poverty strategy last year, and obviously was also quite a politically hot time. So 9 of the seats in the 100 with the highest risk score are marginal seats. What that does is to get political journalists to cover it as well as economics journalists. So there's a very specific purpose to putting it in that way. We can then, within the press release, give some nice rankings. Here are the 10 constituencies with the worst score on this one and the best score on that one. Here's the constituencies with the worst skills record or the worst earnings. And so it let us get national media to cover it because they always want examples. They want to be able to tie it to, I think one of them went as far as Theresa May's constituency is this. But that was the hook for the story. They then talked about the core issues we wanted to be important. We also, though, were able to pull them out for regional and local press releases, so to have tailored facts and figures which would get those regional and local media to cover it, would let local poverty groups, for instance, have something they could use in their work. And we also used it for briefings for specific MPs that we wanted to engage because we knew they're interested in these things, or they're on select committees, or they are influential in some way. For the mayor, we did mayoral briefings for all the mayoral elections. We drew on this for that, and also for local authority policymakers to pull together tailored briefings for them. The second example, as I said, is a much more in-depth study, which I think comes much more from the angle of actually understanding a national problem and influencing what kinds of policies you might want to push for. So this was the University of Sheffield, and what they did was a neighbourhood level analysis in deprived parts of the country, looking at the patterns of labour market disconnection and housing disconnection. So essentially where you had areas, very deprived areas, you then looked at the commuting and migration data, and it told you whether somebody in this small deprived neighbourhoods, where they have got jobs, where are they going to those jobs? So how close are the jobs they're getting, how far away, what kind of jobs are they getting? And the same for housing. So can people in this tiny little area, can they access the right kind of housing? Where would the housing be which would actually match up to their affordability and their job prospects? Again, I've just given you there the headline, which was from the national press release, which was about the 2,300 neighbourhoods missing out from record employment despite jobs on the doorstep. You can see the influence of our media team with the jobs on the doorstep line particularly, which I don't think is anything the researchers might have said. So some of the detail of the findings, there's a massive amount in this project, but some of the core things that came out which influenced both how we thought about some of these issues and how some of our stakeholders thought about it. First of all, the kind of perennial thing, but I think it's very well worth demonstrating that deprived areas are very different. There isn't one type of deprived area, therefore there's not one type of solution to deprivation. The second point, that just getting local jobs in doesn't translate into local employment necessarily. There are a lot of examples where you've got very deprived areas with people who need jobs, who are looking for jobs. You've got loads of jobs being created within metres sometimes, but it's not those residents who are getting those jobs. It's people coming in from more prosperous areas that then pick up those jobs. There's also an issue for some places of what the researchers call double disconnection. So neighbourhoods which were disconnected from local labour markets and sources of jobs, and are also disconnected from other places in terms of housing. They tend to be quite isolated. People don't tend to move around very much or have links to other parts of their area. As I said, this issue of the mismatch of where the people live and where the jobs are, now that can be quite interesting because you can get places where actually there's a geographical match, so the jobs are where the people who need them, but the mismatch is about skills or about health, which prevents people accessing those jobs. For other people, you can see a geographical mismatch. So you can see a place where the people are here, they need the jobs. In theory, they could get these jobs which have been created, but actually, although it's quite near, the bus routes all go the opposite direction. And you can get into very detailed things around this city has a radial bus network, and that is preventing people getting to the jobs which could improve their citywide deprivation indices and create more growth. And actually being able to break this stuff down in a very detailed way is incredibly powerful, particularly when you're talking to local stakeholders who are trying to put together citywide economic strategies. So in terms of policy relevance, on a national level, there was, for the election, and hopefully there still will be, a lot of work going on to put together an industrial strategy. And one of the things that the people developing that were looking at was thinking about deprived neighbourhoods, thinking about geographical connections between the people that the industrial strategy should be benefiting and whether that would actually happen. So in particular, there was a Cabinet Committee for Economic and Industrial, the Economy and Industrial Strategy, who were looking at how you boost growth and productivity across parts of the country where those things are not happening, and particularly thinking about skills policies and employment policies for that. And also for the core cities, that work has been quite important. Firstly, actually to challenge the stories some of them were telling about themselves. So in quite a lot of the cities, they have a very positive narrative about a booming economy, about lots of things going in the right direction, which is fine, but actually we use this research to say to them, look, you still have 34% of the neighbourhoods in core cities are in the 5th most deprived in the country. So yes, Manchester, you're booming, well done. Have you thought about this bit which is not being touched, really, by your economic success? And we could pull out the specific story for each core city and how that related to the story they wanted to tell about themselves. We also then could talk to them about the need to focus on inclusive growth, not just on growth per se, and how they might use the new powers that were coming down the line to them. So a lot of them were in a really intensive period of saying, look, we're getting powers, we're getting money, how are we going to make sure that we use those in the best way possible? this enabled us to really give them some pointers on where geographically they might focus their efforts, but also what issues they might focus their efforts on for specific places. And lastly, it also helped us talk with the core cities about what they should argue for the post-Brexit settlement. So the issue that we and others have been trying to raise about if the EU structural funding, when that goes, there will be a replacement of sorts, we should take this opportunity to think about not just how much is it, but where does it go and how is it used. This is a chance to do better for regional policy than we actually have done. So EU money has been used for great things, but it actually has been a fairly clunky tool for what people want to use it for. This is a chance to revamp it. Let's actually use some evidence on what will be the most effective way of using that money. So finally, just to talk through the kind of impacts we saw from those two bits of work. So first of all, as I said, for us, getting media profile in itself isn't a particular goal, but getting the right stories in the right places to influence the people we want to take action is important. So for the Working Age Poverty Risk Index, as I said, we used that particularly in the run-up to the publishing our strategy to solve poverty last autumn. And the media team used it firstly to land a piece, quite a good piece in The Sun, which is quite a difficult place to get to cover these things well. But we got quite a meaty piece in The Sun, and it was mainly because we had this constituency data we could talk them through. What it also actually did was lead to a lot of local media coverage. So the day we published the strategy, I spent 2 hours doing back-to-back interviews with local radio stations, and for each one I could give them different stats to say why what we're publishing today is useful for them. I doubt we'd have got either of those things if we hadn't had that kind of analysis, as well as the much broader policy work that we were trying to sell into them. For the disconnected neighbourhoods, one of the particular things that happened from the media was that we got the Financial Times to run quite a big piece, putting forward quite a detailed look at what we were arguing for. And again, what was quite clear was that the two things that got the FT to cover it were firstly the message about people missing out on jobs on the doorstep, that grabbed the economics editor's kind of imagination, but also the data visualisation. So for their website, they wanted to be able to show whizzy, pretty maps of things. And this research lent itself incredibly well to that, and lent itself to kind of very much a user-led tool. So being able to let their readers zoom in on different areas, it's something they really wanted to promote, and the analysis we had was a good vehicle for that. But it also, from our point of view, meant that we could engage first them and then their readers in what we were doing. From the national government side of things, in particular, the disconnected neighbourhoods work was quite useful. So we got asked to come into the Treasury and brief the policy advisors who were thinking about decentralisation and growth. We used it a lot in briefing MPs, some of the MPs in different places that we wanted to engage, either because we knew they're interested, or because they sit on important select committees or are influential in some way, or because if you're a Manchester MP, we would like you to be kind of singing from the same hymn book as the Manchester Mayor. If we're trying to convince him of things, we want the MPs to be on side as well. And we also found actually that quite a few MPs got in touch with us to say, we're trying to get action in our areas on this. Can we have the data for our areas? Can you talk us through how to use it? Because we can use it to kind of kickstart some action on that. And then finally, at a city level particularly, we've seen a lot of take-up from both our inclusive growth monitor and the disconnected neighbourhoods work. So Leeds City Region, we've had a partnership with them for several years now, and they've used a lot of this data to target their strategy for different localities. So they identified 6 local neighbourhoods out of our disconnected neighbourhoods work, which they were going to make their priority. They also adopted several of our inclusive growth indicators into their success measures for their strategy. We've also found in Manchester, we have an inclusive growth unit at Manchester University that we work very closely with and we fund. They then have a lot of influence on the Greater Manchester Economic Review, and they were bringing in the inclusive growth monitor work and disconnected neighbourhoods work. And we've also had Bristol City Region get in touch and say they're doing a whole load of work on what they're calling gentrification, but they wanted to use the disconnected neighbourhoods data to help them target that. So in all cases, it's partly having the data and it's partly them being able to explain to them what it means, how to use it, and then being able to suggest what it might mean about the policies that would be more or less effective. So that's, I think, all I wanted to say today about what we've done. I suspect people here have got a lot of experience of using this kind of analysis, so it would be great to hear of how you found it's worked well and if we've got any ideas we can take away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was really, really interesting. As Helen said, she'd be very happy to take questions.
Yes, how do you go about running timescales to make sure research is available for policymakers?
Yeah, I think we're slowly getting better at it is the answer. It's a really hard one because quite often the research you really need will be with you in 2 years. And that's fine from a research point of view and incredibly annoying for the policymakers you've gone in to see, and kind of they say, great, can you give it to us? You know, we're writing a policy now and you haven't got it. I mean, so I suppose for us there is a number of different things. Partly I think it's about having a mix of different kinds of research. So some of these issues, you need the 2 years. You need really in-depth, long-term work. You can't do it quickly or there's no point doing it. So I think for us, I guess it's about picking the themes that we think are going to be serious underlying themes for quite a while and focusing that kind of resource on those. And then having enough capacity to do the kind of short, sharp analysis, which either builds it, because I mean, what I quite often find is that once you've got a research programme that's done the building blocks, you can do little bits of additional analysis that make it relevant again, whereas, you know, in some ways you're telling a very similar story, but you're telling it with a bit of new analysis, and therefore you can get it in. Or there's analysis like, I mean, the risk index didn't take very long. It's not particularly technical. But it gives a way into some of our other research, which took a lot longer. But I would also say, I guess, that over the years, we've slowly built up both our direct engagement with stakeholders, so we know people well enough to know what they're worried about, but also we've now got a really good public affairs team who keep a very strong eye on what's going on at a government level. Again, they have relationships, so they know what people are worried about and what's coming, and a very good comms team who can look ahead and see. But yeah, so we used to have what we referred to as the sausage factory, where we commission a bunch of research we like, we get the research done, and then we publish it when it's ready, and we just kind of hope it lands. Over the years, we've been wrenching ourselves away from the sausage factory and towards saying, let's think about impact. If you publish something at the right time, you get the impact. If you publish it at the wrong time, nobody notices. One of the ways we've done that, though, is to do less. So one of the conversations we had with all of our comms teams and our colleagues was to say, we have to give them less to do so they can do more with what we have got. And that's been, I think, quite a painful process for many people. But that's been quite important, because if you've got the sausage factory, there isn't time to plan it, there isn't time to kind of tailor it in the way you need to. The thing I was amazed about is my media colleagues always say we need a new stat to sell a story. I'm actually amazed by how often something which I think from a research point of view is completely unsurprising suddenly gets taken up as if it's new. So we had that with the big report last year. We published this report, which had essentially the same finding as it had for 5 years, which was about in-work poverty and housing costs. But it was told in a new way, it hit a moment, it went crazy on the media. It wasn't actually new in any way, in my view, but it was presented in a way that felt new, I guess, and it kind of caught a moment.
And also, can I ask, what do you do about the review process?
So we've got a couple of layers of reviews. So most big projects or programmes will almost always have advisory groups, and we try and construct those to have a mixture of the kind of either policy people or people who represent the kind of audiences we want to use it to help us understand if we're coming up with something they'll use, and research technical people who can help with that peer review process. We also, so that with it, the way we work is there would always be a policy and research manager or an analysis manager who is in charge of the work in-house. Part of their job is to either quality assure it themselves, or if they don't have the technical skills, to get somebody to quality assure it who does. Now we've got an in-house analysis unit. I'm also kind of pushing forward as we get more staff to have one of my team quality assure stats, particularly stats that are given additional profile. Because one of the things I've seen is that if you've got a big report with lots of statistics, if one or two are a bit flaky, it's not ideal, but you can live with it. If you're going to pick something out and make it a really flagship, high-profile stat, you want to be absolutely sure it's robust. And it can take a higher level of scrutiny than would be the case if it's just as an individual report. So I want them all to be at that level, but particularly anything that, you know, is going to go in a press release, is going to go in a stat of the week, is going to be quoted by the chief executive. It has to be, hopefully, uncontestable and honest. I think there's something really important about trying to give an honest portrayal of what the evidence says, not what it would be most convenient to say. I think we've got, should we take 2 or 3 at once, perhaps? And then get
Yes, that's a
conversation?
good idea.
Is that
So,
right?
do you ever have anybody on the panel who's got lived experience of the issues under discussion? And you had a question as well.
I did, and I think we're touching on this all the way through.
Yeah.
I work with the lottery fund, and often we're working with projects that are up, you know, well into the community. And I was asking, how accessible is the data you're providing? How low do you go? And is it easily accessible, or do you just Google it, or how do you best access all that? Or is it going to be too high level data, or do we...
Okay. Was there a third question? Was it?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is actually just in relation to the geographical analysis. How, obviously you do quite lots of longitudinal work anyway, but how do you actually link the geographical to the longitudinal and sort of follow that through? Because at the moment, the examples you've given are kind of static
Cross-sectional,
reports,
yeah.
and I'd be quite interested to know how you are thinking about going forward.
Yeah. Yes, it absolutely does. I might do that one first, if that's all right, just because it's... one of the issues I think we have is that the data sets which are good for longitudinal analysis rarely go down to geographical levels that we'd like. I mean, that's a fundamental problem I think a lot of researchers have. So the one which is best for our kind of stuff on longitudinal work is understanding society. And now there's been a couple of people who've done some very good work linking that back to the BHPS to let you look at persistent poverty. And that's actually quite a big step forward in itself, just being able to link that back. But something like understanding society, you can do categories of areas. So it's big enough that you can, if you want, you can look at kind of a certain type of deprived area, for instance, but you can't go down to local authority level. So essentially, well, from what I've seen, pretty much when you want to go down to geographical levels, what you have to do is look at kind of snapshots, cross-sections over time. So you can say how an area has changed, but obviously you then need to think about, has it changed because people have moved out? I mean, it's a classic thing with urban regeneration, wasn't it? That one of the problems is that the people it benefits leave the area, and therefore the area level indicator doesn't change, even if the policy's been successful.
Yeah.
I guess, so when you're just using secondary data, I think it's, for me, you usually have to choose. Either you do longitudinal at a higher level, or you do geographical but lower level, but it's got to be cross-sectional. The other thing, though, is you can commission bespoke things. So a few years ago, I funded some education research, which was done in 3 areas. So it was Glasgow, London, and one other, Nottingham, I think it was. And it was trying to look at how young people's attitudes and aspirations changed over a period of a couple of years, kind of crucial years in secondary school. So they did bespoke surveys, qualitative research with young people, teachers, parents. So they had, kind of small but useful data sets, so you could see in those very different places and different labour markets, how did those people's views change. But obviously that's, it's very resource intensive to do that, so you've got to have a good reason. So I don't have any bright ideas. If you have any, please let us know, because we'd love to do it too. The access, so, I mean, basically Google is the best way. Google it, look at our website and the newsletter. If in doubt, you can always email somebody, and generally one of us will be able to work out if something's available. So we try and make everything openly available. I think there is a different question, which is about which audiences is it best tailored to, because just being out there doesn't make it accessible. For us, that comes back to the kind of theory of change. So why did we do the work? So, for instance, I do know that very small-scale grassroots groups, for instance, who want data to make a case, we will rarely have data at their geographical level to make their case. Quite often they can come to us for the broader arguments, but they then need to find local data. I mean, I think University of Manchester, they do their local poverty profile, which for Manchester gives some quite useful stuff. In London, there's the London poverty profile, which only goes down to local authority, but it's pretty good. So what we try and do is make sure our work reaches the people we want to act on it, whoever that happens to be, and that it's open to everyone else. But we can't customise everything for every audience, I think is the answer. The lived experience is I think it's a really, really interesting one. And it's part of a big, so we've had a big push in the last few years, and it's getting bigger now to get better at the kind of participatory approach. So I would say if you looked at us 10 years ago, we had surprising little contact with the people for whom we are supposedly acting. That's probably still true, actually, but at least we've realised it. I think the way in which you involve people, though, is really important. So, for instance, if you've got an advisory group for a very technical analysis project, I think you have to think quite carefully about why would you be involving people, what would you want from them, what result would they see from it, and how would it feel to be involved in that. So one of the things we've done quite in the last year or so is we've now got a manager in specifically to help us develop participatory approaches across our different work. And she's really good at kind of making it clear so people come and say, we want to do some participation, and she'll say, okay, that's not participation because you want to talk to a couple of groups of people to inform the writing of something. And I think that's okay, you know, for as far as it goes. But from the point of view of the people that are being involved, they're not setting the agenda, they're not going to change the findings by and large because it's research. So you have to be quite careful. I think there was an awful lot of tokenistic involvement, and some communities get rightly really sick of it because they never see anything back. So what we're trying to move to do is having more involvement of people with lived experience setting our agenda, more involvement to help us think about the bits of it which research doesn't tell you. So, for instance, we've got a universal credit briefing coming up. We're doing some very techie modelling to say, with a given amount of money, what could you do with it, who would get that money. The bit that I think it would be really useful, we're going to be working with a couple of groups of claimants, is two things. One is to talk to them about what would actually make a difference in their lives. So, for instance, if you unfreeze benefits and you got X amount pounds more, what difference would that make to your weekly budgets? Would it make a difference? What would you spend it on? If we have, say, 3 options which cost the same but which do things slightly differently, do they care? Does it matter? Would they rather have something through a certain mechanism? Are there other things that would make a bit? So trying to get that, I guess, the implementation advice you can get from people who know the system and they will know things we don't. The what difference would it make bit? And on public services, I think that's where you can get really powerful involvement. But I think that for a while ago we had this push to get people who've lived experience advising on everything. And we actually kind of pushed back and said that doesn't feel appropriate. It feels like a burden on people without giving them power. That's the thing, isn't it? You have to trade off what are we getting from them and what are we giving. And a lot of participation, there's more giving than getting power. And I think that's very true of us, and we're working on it, but we're definitely not there. Sorry, the other thing I would say, the other thing I think is a really interesting dynamic of that is about social attitudes. So I think there was something really interesting around the whole Brexit vote, that many of the groups who advocate on behalf of low-income communities were very kind of sure that Brexit was a bad idea. Many of the communities they advocate on by voted massively to leave the EU. And you then have this really hard conversation about kind of people thinking, hang on a minute, we think they're wrong because we think they will be damaged, but are we in any position? There was this kind of people's heads exploded a bit. But I think the core of it, though, is thinking about class in a way. Most of the people who work on these issues come from one part of society, and most of the people they're working on behalf of come from a different part of society, and you have different social attitudes. We need to bring those closer together in order to kind of stop getting that divide.
Thank you. Yes, we'll take a couple more questions, yes?
Yeah, it's a bit of a wide-ranging question, actually. I like to think of maps as the new charts, really, in terms of data visualisation, and we can see some stuff.
Right, so how can social researchers make best use of data visualisation, maps as charts? And I think the gentleman at the back, you had a question as well?
Yeah, it actually follows up on the lived experience thing again. Just to sort of push it a little bit more, I was at somewhere where Sarah Campbell was there last night, actually. And I just think it's kind of quite interesting to sort of see you sort of saying what that power dynamic, if that's the right phrase, and what you're doing to, what is it that you are trying to do to sort of equalise that power dynamic, if that makes sense? Because I know that you are working in Leeds, Manchester and so forth, but I always feel that very much what you were sort of saying, that there is an aspect of tokenism, there can be an aspect of tokenism. So how do you actually, for instance, in terms of your reports, how do you actually make those reports accessible and meaningful, if that makes sense, to people? Because, like you say, you have it for different audiences, and I suspect your media produce very different stuff for some as they do for Financial Times. And so I was just kind of really interested to sort of see how you are, as an organisation, trying to really push that, if that makes sense, and to sort of actually make it meaningful rather than tokenistic, and sort of how that's going to work.
So how can you make data meaningful for the people who are the research, I guess?
Sort of how that may then lead on to what you actually commission into the future as well.
Okay. Okay. I mean, on the mapping one, I'm not a data visual. I mean, I have a couple of people work for me who do a lot of data visualization. I suppose the thing that I tend to think about it is you can get a mismatch between the people who are thinking about what's the purpose of doing this and what are we trying to achieve, and the people who have the technical skills to think about different ways you can visualize things. And there is something very important about trying to make it a joint conversation. So I find that you quite often get into these things where people come along who are very excited about a technical, whizzy way of showing something, but have no strong sense of what you would hope to achieve by using it. And on the other hand, the people who have a really strong idea of what they want to achieve don't know enough about the technicalities to either have their horizons expanded and say, actually, you could do something completely different that could be really exciting, or even just pick well. So, I mean, there's the, I think it was the Guardian's data visualization team used to be in the Guardian, then they got spun off into a separate company, and we had them in to do some work with both my team and the comms department around data visualization. And it was really interesting talking with them about the kind of process, the different process you go through to kind of isolate a message, to think about what you're trying to show, to think about how you show it. And there's this, they were talking about there's this struggle between people who want to have really stripped down bare charts to just show numbers, and who want that to be uncluttered and kind of not who feel it's more honest to just do that, and people who say you need to wrap it up in much more in a package that lets people engage emotionally with it. And those are two schools of thought in data visualization, and you can kind of do both, but you do to some extent have to pick. I think also when you get into visualization, there's a lot of unintended things. So, just on the basis you're using pictures to convey things, you have to think quite carefully about what the pictures might suggest. On a very basic level, are you showing all the, what are you saying about the people you're talking about inadvertently with the iconography you choose? And again, you need to bring together the people who have the skills to think about what are your options. Either they need enough knowledge to pick well, or they need a really close working relationship with the data producers and policy people, and ideally people who know the communities they're representing, to get that right. There's certainly been things we've done where we had one the other day, we put out something which was about mental health with children, and there was a whole debate between lots of people about which pictures to use, which I kind of stayed out of. And then it went out and they were all wearing ties. And it wasn't a big deal, but I was like, really? Are they office workers? Are they tiny little office workers with mental health problems? And then I had an argument about whether school children still wear ties, because mine are primary school, so they don't. But anyway, so it was a tiny little thing, but it had already eaten up half a day of two people's time arguing, so I thought, I'm not going to get into this. But little things like that, things can get stuck in that way. And we've had very angry people on Twitter who haven't liked the pictures we've used. And sometimes you think it's just angry people on Twitter, but sometimes it's a real thing. It's somebody saying you're inadvertently perpetrating a stereotype which is damaging, and you need to kind of take that and say, yeah, good point, let's do better. Yes, I don't know. In terms of how the community, my experience is that most researchers who I know, in-house and out-house, are quite far behind what is possible to do with visualisation. My feel is I don't think those two groups are very close together yet. Whereas I get kind of marketing approaches from people who are selling me something they believe will solve poverty because it's a better picture. And I don't think, I don't think I'm actually in a very good place to judge, and one of the things I want my team to get better at is that judgment part of it. Going back to the lived experience and that para thing, I would say we're definitely at the start of doing it properly. We've dabbled for years. And I suppose we're trying to think about when we're giving control and power to people. So I think some of the Poverty Truth Commissions which we've supported, those I think have been a really good example of participation, because they do this combination of kind of upskilling and supporting people. Because I think the other thing is that most people who aren't involved in the policy world would find it fairly hard to walk into a room of policy people and challenge, regardless of your background, your income or anything else about you. And the fact that you happen to have experienced very difficult things, whether that's poverty or mental health or anything else, doesn't make you per se better at going in and challenging whoever the local authority. And I think there can be something about exposing people, and the same with the media. So obviously media always want case studies, and that's important to them to tell the story, and that's fine. But I think we would always try and go through local support organisations for that, because they can judge, they can help people decide whether they're up for this, and they can give them support which we're not able to give. So I think with the Poverty Truth Commissions, my understanding is they did an immense amount of, capacity building, confidence building, so that everybody on that commission could actually take part with equal power. So you could get somebody from a local community challenging the local authority public health lead, for instance, and have a conversation, and that group together decided the agenda rather than the funders or anyone else. So that, I think, is a good example that I think we'd like to do more. The Hartlepool lab stuff, actually, as well. We're doing this Hartlepool Action Lab, where, again, it's getting local people together. They've picked the issues. We've supported them in terms of researching local issues. We've supported them with some policy knowledge. But they have picked what issues they think are important for Hartlepool. They've picked how they want to do it. For me, there's always an issue of scaling. I can see that being really effective in that small area. It doesn't feel to me like a solution to UK poverty, but maybe it doesn't have to be. I think connecting that, I find it hard currently to draw that line. How do you get from very localised participatory work to national solutions which reflect those things? And I don't have an answer, I think, but it's a tricky one.
Just interested in finding out if you've been involved in some research with regards to the impact of the increase of fees and the dwindling and disappearance of government subsidies for learning programmes like languages and all of that. And if you've been able to do some research to find out if that has affected with data the enrolment. There are some anecdotal evidence, of course, that we observe, but has there been any systematic research in that area to...
do you mean tuition fees? Or
yeah, the tuition fees and...
Because there's tuition fees and then there's ESOL and so on as well.
Yeah, no, the tuition fees, and we used to have some funding as well for language programmes, government funding for that.
As in language teaching?
Yeah, yeah. And then, I'm interested in finding out how poverty can contribute to probably discouraging some prospective students from enrolment. Have you done any?
We haven't, but I have looked at it when we were putting together the strategy. You may not like the answer. So tuition fees, what the research suggests is, so tuition fees don't appear to have led to any drop-off in applications from people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Those applications have continued to increase. We don't know, of course, whether in the absence of tuition fees they would have gone up even more, but there is certainly no evidence that tuition fees have been reducing the number of people from disadvantaged backgrounds going to university. it's funny because in economic terms that makes sense, because the tuition fee system, you only pay it back if you end up earning quite a lot. If you never earn, then you don't pay it back and they get a free education. There is then, the issue about people being worried about debt, which is what you get a lot through the anecdotal issue. I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure it affects some people. What the data suggests is that that doesn't affect enough people to affect the trends. So, I mean, to be honest, from a poverty perspective, whatever one thinks about the introduction of tuition fees, I wouldn't put any money into getting rid of them. If you want to put money into stuff, put it into FE. In terms of education, if you want to do something for poverty, the biggest thing that stops people in poverty going to university is the fact that 2/3 of them don't get 5 good GCSEs.
Yeah.
So we need better early education, we need the attainment gap. After that, the vast majority of kids from poor backgrounds end up in FE colleges, which are underfunded and have been losing funding, and there are big quality issues about the service a lot of FE colleges give people, which, given who it's serving, I think should be a massive priority, and yet isn't. Then there is the issue about once you do get to university, there are issues about who does well and who doesn't. So the people who are less likely to go are also more likely to drop out and to get lower grades and so on. There is a big issue from an equality point of view of the fact that people from some ethnic minority groups are more likely to go but don't get the labour market payoff they should. And there's some research we've done at that. But no, in itself, tuition fees, if you want to, if you're worried about poverty, I would always say forget about tuition fees for the moment and shout incredibly loudly about FE funding and the quality of FE and the quality of apprenticeships and who's getting into apprenticeships. Because apprenticeships are supposed to be the answer to a lot of this stuff, but when you look at who's getting them, when you look at who gets into them, there are some really big issues when you look at the quality of apprenticeships and the people who go into what you might call poor quality apprenticeships, in the sense of not very good training, not much progression, in jobs where they're never going to make much progression. It's disproportionately poorer kids from certain ethnic minority backgrounds, certain parts of the country. And I think, this is public money, it should be being used much more effectively than it is. On the languages, I don't think there's anything I've seen. Certainly on ESOL, there's a lot of research around that suggests that, I think two things. One is that cuts to ESOL are a problem, but two is that quite a lot of ESOL isn't very good. So in a sense, there's two things. There's the kind of delivering more ESOL to people who needs it, but actually doing it quite a lot better than it has been done if we're going to put money into it.
Okay, I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. Okay, yeah. Yes.
I guess I one question. You mentioned the heart report stuff you do at the local level. I guess what I'm interested in is or have you ideas about how you link that to the sort of local economic development stuff, the inclusive growth, which is kind of at a higher level.
Yeah.
So is there any ideas or things coming out of that? How do you make that?
Okay, so linking the local, the local inclusive project to the actual growth, and you had a question as well.
Yeah, I'm just referring back to your stint on local radios, really. I just wonder how, and point about stereotypes and things like that. I just wonder whether, coastal towns might get sort of sick about hearing about poor educational attainment, poor health, inequality, dependency, life expectancy. I guess it goes on and on and on and on, doesn't it? So I just wondered whether you meet any challenge when you're delivering findings at that level.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Yeah, I think there is. Well, there's a national issue and a local one. So I think there is. I also slightly struggle with to get good coverage. People want you to give specific examples. Once you give specific examples, what you do is highlight a particular place as the kind of poster child for whatever problem you're talking about. And that's always a trade-off, I think. So I guess it partly depends what you're trying to achieve. And I think for me, you have to come back to what you're trying to achieve with this and what's the trade-off of benefit and so on. I think there is something you can often do. So for most places have good things and bad things about them. And so one of the things we do try and do is get some balance. So you don't bring out a press release that says, let's abolish Hull, it's appalling on all these things. You bring out something which says, here's an example of a certain set of issues, here's some good things that are happening, and you try and at least get balance. When you're actually on radio shows, to be honest, it's much easier because, like, I've done some phone-ins, which are always a nightmare, but So you can get somebody in and shouting at you about something. I think to some extent you have to kind of acknowledge that people know their own area, and they have an absolute right to say, actually, there's wonderful things about this area, you're doing us down. The response, is kind of, yes, that's great, well done. We're also saying here are some other things we think could be done. I think, yes, but there is something very interesting about telling people they are wrong about their own area, which is what you can get into if you're not careful. And I think it's about being careful about what the evidence actually shows and what it doesn't. So a lot of the time, I think what you get is national or local authority or even other data. It gives you a real picture, but it will not be true for every small part of every area, and it's important to acknowledge that. So one of the biggest things, for instance, around Brexit and the referendum is immigration. So there's very good analysis about the national level impact of immigration on employment, on wages and so on. When we looked, though, what I don't think there actually exists, and I'm debating whether or not we should try and do it, is very local labour market analysis. So there is some, I think we're putting money now into an ESRC project which is going to look in much more detail. So, and that I'll be very interested to see whether whether there is something about in certain local labour markets, immigration might be having a negative effect on people who are there in a way that it certainly doesn't have nationally, which could help explain the disconnect between the national economist story and people's local feelings. But then there's also, people can recognise a genuine problem and attribute it to a cause which the evidence might say we don't think it really is caused by this. And I think you have to have that conversation as well. But yeah, the other thing I was going to say, the other thing we're doing around the, it's not really lived experience, but it's kind of the people side, is thinking about framing. So we've got this partnership with the Frameworks Institute in the US, who are, they're semanticists, they're psychologists, they're really interesting people. And what they've done for a lot of charities and causes is to look at how your messages actually land in people's brains. So the idea is everybody carries around cultural frameworks, and any particular piece of information gets fitted into a cultural framework, like a story you're telling. Most people have multiple stories in their heads which contradict one another, and that's fine. We do that a lot. When you give a message, you will trigger one of those cultural frameworks, and if you trigger the wrong one, your message won't land. So an obvious thing, there's a TED talk about it, which is all about how, I think, about charities trying to get people to support the cause of, supporting people with drug addiction and extreme problems. And there were 3 ways they kind of sold that message. So you could sell it on a, we are a community that helps each other, this is part of solidarity. You could sell it on a, this costs us all. You could sell it on a, empathise with these people who've had many problems. So 3 different ways you can sell that story. They tested selling the story in different ways. The charity's dominant way of telling the story was the empathy one. Look at this person, sympathise with them, which, when they tested it, reduces support for the message as compared to the other 2 ways of telling the story. And we've been doing the same thing on poverty. So going out with these guys, doing lots of really detailed qual research about how people hear what we and everyone else says. And what you find, one of the things that's quite difficult for the sector to hear is myth-busting not only doesn't work, which everyone knew, it actively damages your cause. Because if you take on what you view as a myth, saying this is wrong, people just hear the this. You trigger that cultural framework, everything else you say is lost. So we're working with frameworks and with some other charities and people to come up with what is the way of talking about poverty which will actually engage people, rather than just saying all these people are wrong, let's persuade them of what we think, which is right. People aren't wrong, they just have different ways of viewing the issue. You need to trigger the right way if you want them to take your message. So anyway, it's fascinating. It gets really interesting when you look at all the way charities behave and how we use our money. Okay. Anyway, I think there was a question I didn't answer, for which I apologise, but I've got myself lost in other things.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. Please do fill out your evaluation forms and tell us what future events you would like, and particularly if you'd like to get involved. Personally, I don't think we could have had a more interesting and engaging and thought-provoking speaker than Helen, so please let's thank her in the usual way. And please do stay for drinks and snacks.